The letter hit the floor of the sheriff's office like a death sentence. Eli Rourke stood frozen in the doorway, his deputy's badge catching the last hard light of a New Mexico afternoon in the year 1878, and he stared at the name written on that envelope. Not his name, not the sheriff's name. The name of a woman he had never spoken to, never introduced himself to, never so much as shared a proper greeting with, and yet a name that had lived inside his chest for 3 months like a splinter too deep to reach. Catherine Finley. The letter was addressed to her in handwriting he recognized. He recognized it because he had spent the better part of the last season cataloging evidence against the man who wrote it. Wade Harlan. Cattle baron. Blackmailer. The most dangerous man in Cobb County, and the one man who had the power to destroy everything Catherine Finley had quietly, carefully, painstakingly built for herself in the dusty little town of Redrock, New Mexico. Sheriff Tom Briggs stood behind his desk with his arms crossed and his expression carrying the particular weight of a man who had just made a decision he already regretted. "She knows," he said flatly. "Harlan sent her that this morning. She came in an hour ago, left it here, and told me she intended to handle the matter herself." Eli's jaw tightened. The splinter in his chest drove itself half an inch deeper. "Handle it herself how?" Briggs said nothing, which was answer enough. "Where is she?" "Eli, where is she, Tom?" Briggs rubbed the back of his neck. "She was heading toward Harlan's property line when Frank Dole saw her ride out, alone, with a rifle across her saddle," the chair scraping back, the door swinging open. The badge catching the light one more time before Eli Rourke was already moving, already running toward the livery, because he had spent 3 months learning the particular music of Catherine Finley's laughter from a careful and respectful distance, and he was not about to let Wade Harlan be the reason that music went silent. He had never told her his name. She had certainly never told him hers. And somehow, impossibly, irreversibly, she had become the person he would ride into danger for without a second breath of hesitation. That was the moment, the running, the urgency, the name on the letter burning in his mind that contained everything that needed to be explained. And to explain it properly, you had to go back 3 months, to a Tuesday in late summer when Eli Rourke arrived in Redrock, New Mexico, on the back of a road-weary horse with a deputy's commission in his saddlebag, and the particular kind of loneliness that a man carries when he has been moving so long he has forgotten what it feels like to stay. Redrock was not a glamorous town. It sat in the middle of the high desert like something the landscape had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in, a main street of hard-packed dirt, a general store, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a small schoolhouse, a church that needed a new roof, a telegraph office, a livery, and a sheriff's office with a leaky window on the north wall that Eli would come to know intimately over the following weeks. The population numbered somewhere around 300 souls, and those souls existed in the way that frontier people tended to, with their backs straight, and their eyes watchful, and their capacity for hardship worn like a second skin. Eli had come because Sheriff Tom Briggs had requested a deputy through the territorial marshal's office, citing the growing influence of Wade Harlan and his outfit as a concern that required more law than one aging sheriff could manage. The territorial marshal had looked at Eli's record solid, unspectacular, built on quiet competence rather than dramatic legend, and sent him south. Eli was 28 years old. He had brown hair that needed cutting, a face that had learned to be patient before the rest of him had, and a tendency to observe a situation thoroughly before he inserted himself into it. He was not a man given to grand gestures or loud opinions. He had grown up in Kansas, lost his mother when he was 12, worked cattle with his father until he was 17, and then found his way into law enforcement through a combination of circumstance and the discovery that he was uncommonly good at reading people. He arrived in Redrock on a Tuesday, stabled his horse, a gray gelding he had named Porter, and walked the length of the main street before he presented himself to Briggs. It was during that walk that he first heard the laugh. It came from inside the general store, through the propped-open front door. It was not a polite, restrained laugh. It was not the careful, measured sound that women in that era were frequently encouraged to produce in public. It was a full and genuine and entirely unself-conscious laugh, the kind that came from a person who found something genuinely funny and did not particularly care who knew it. It was warm and a little breathless, and it had a musical quality that hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a well-aimed stone skipping across still water. He did not go inside. He was aware, in the particular way that a man of his temperament was aware of such things, that walking into a store simply because he had been charmed by a laugh he'd heard through a doorway was not behavior becoming of a deputy about to introduce himself to a community. So he kept walking, filed the sound away in some back room of his mind, and reported to Briggs. It took him another 4 days to see her face, and by then he had already heard the laugh twice more. The first additional instance had been on a Thursday morning, when he was crossing the street and she was coming out of the telegraph office, apparently having received some piece of news that delighted her, sharing the moment with the telegraph operator's wife in the doorway. The second had been on a Friday evening, outside the Copper Nail, where she was standing with 2 other women, and a conversation had evidently reached some conclusion that required the full, unrestrained version of the sound. On Sunday morning, he saw her at the church. She sat 3 rows ahead of him and to the left, and he had the clear, unobstructed profile of her face for the entirety of the service. She was perhaps 25, though he would later learn she was 26. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up in the manner of the time, though a few strands had escaped at the nape of her neck in a way that suggested her hair was not naturally inclined toward formal arrangements. She had a strong, direct quality to her posture, not rigid, but settled, like a person who was comfortable occupying the space they stood in. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, which he noticed because she turned her head at one point and the light caught it. She did not laugh during the church service. The minister did not provide adequate material for that particular response. But she smiled twice at things the minister said, genuine smiles rather than polite ones, and Eli found himself paying considerably more attention to those smiles than to the sermon. He still did not know her name. This was, he would later admit to himself, a choice more than a coincidence. He could have asked Briggs. He could have asked anyone. In a town of 300 people, names were not difficult currency. But asking felt like a thing that would change the situation from the particular kind of suspended possibility it currently occupied to something more defined and therefore more fragile. As long as he did not know her name, she existed in his mind as something slightly abstract. The laugh, the profile, the scar above her eye, and abstract things could not disappoint you the way that real and fully named things could. This was not entirely rational reasoning, and some part of him knew it. But he was 30 days into a new posting in a new town with a dangerous situation to navigate, and the laugh was the nicest thing in his daily landscape, and he was, perhaps, being somewhat protective of it. He learned what she did before he learned who she was. That also took about 2 weeks. Catherine Finley, though he still did not know her name, ran a millinery and dressmaking shop on the east end of the main street. The shop had a painted sign with faded lettering and a window display that changed every week or so, featuring whatever new work she had completed. She also, as he gradually pieced together from observation and the ambient conversation of a small town, served as something of an informal record-keeper for the community. People brought her documents to witness, letters to read aloud when the recipients could not manage printed script, accounting questions when the sums were complicated. She had, it seemed, a reputation for both precision and discretion. He learned this because his job required him to know the community, and knowing the community meant watching how it moved. He was not watching her specifically more than he was watching anyone else. He was simply watching her with a quality of attention that was perhaps marginally sharper. The situation with Wade Harlan was, in the meantime, becoming more pressing. Harlan ran the largest cattle operation in the region, but his real power came from land, specifically from a series of acquisitions over the previous 5 years that had been accomplished through methods that ranged from aggressive but legal to outright coercion. Small ranchers had sold under pressure they would not fully describe. At least 2 families had left the territory under circumstances that Briggs was professionally troubled by but legally unable to address. A water rights dispute that should have gone to arbitration had been resolved in Harlan's favor through what appeared to be the purchase of the arbitrator's cooperation, though proving it was another matter. Eli spent his first weeks in Redrock, building the kind of quiet, thorough picture of Harlan's operation that was necessary before you could begin to do anything about it. He talked to people carefully, listened more than he spoke, kept meticulous notes, and developed a growing sense that the web was larger and more complex than even Briggs had understood. He also, during this same period, began to understand that Catherine Finley was connected to the Harlan situation in a way that nobody had explicitly told him about. He had noticed on 3 separate occasions that Harlan's men, specifically a thick-necked foreman named Cleet Dunbar, had found reasons to pass by her shop. Not entering, not stopping, just passing slowly with a particular quality of deliberate notice, the kind of presence that was meant to be felt rather than confronted. This bothered Eli considerably. It bothered him in the professional sense, because it suggested that Harlan had some specific interest in her operation that was worth cataloging. It bothered him in a second, less professional sense that he spent some effort not examining too closely. The 4th week, he went into her shop. He had a legitimate reason. He needed a button replaced on his vest, and the other option was attempting the repair himself, which previous evidence suggested would result in something worse than the original problem. The shop was small and clean and smelled of fabric, and some faint quality of cedar from the storage chest he could see through the back doorway. There were 3 dresses on display forms, 2 in progress on a workbench, and a wall of shallow drawers that presumably held thread and notions and the small technical materials of the trade. She was behind the counter when he came in, examining something through a pair of small spectacles she was wearing pushed to the end of her nose. She looked up when the bell above the door sounded. Her eyes were a clear, direct gray, and they assessed him with a friendliness that was also, very slightly, an evaluation. "Good afternoon," she said. "You're the new deputy." "I am," he said. He held up the vest. "I need a button. Bring it here." He brought it to the counter. She took it, examined the spot where the button had been, opened one of the drawers behind her, and produced a button that matched the remaining 3 with an exactness that struck him as genuinely impressive. 10 minutes, she said. "You can wait if you like or come back." "I'll wait if it's no inconvenience." "It isn't." She settled onto her work stool, threaded a needle with a practiced efficiency that involved no wasted motion whatsoever, and began. He stood at the counter for a moment, then moved to look at the dresses on the display forms because it gave him something to direct his attention toward. They did not speak for the first 5 minutes. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of a silence between 2 people who were each comfortable enough in their own company that shared quiet did not require filling. "You've been in town about a month," she said, without looking up from her work. "About that. Tom Briggs seems to think well of you. That's generous of him, given that I haven't done very much yet." She glanced up briefly, a small smile. "He says you're thorough. In this particular situation, I expect thorough is more valuable than dramatic." "You know about the situation." It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "Most of the people in this town know about the situation," she said. "The ones who don't know don't want to, and that's a decision I try to respect, though it makes practical matters more complicated." She snipped the thread, held the vest up, examined it, set it down. "Here." He reached for the vest and their fingers did not touch, though the proximity was close enough that he was aware of it as a near thing. He examined the button. It was perfectly and invisibly done. "What do I owe you?" 2 cents, she said. A button and a few minutes of my time does not constitute a hardship. He placed 2 cents on the counter. She swept them into her hand with the same economical motion that characterized everything else she had done, and she returned to the work she had been doing before he arrived. He was at the door when she spoke again. "Deputy," she said. He turned. "The man who has been walking past my shop on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons," she said. "His name is Cleet Dunbar. He works for Wade Harlan. And if you're building a picture of how Harlan operates, the pressure he places on small business owners in this town is worth including in that picture." She had not looked up from her work while she said it. Her voice was level and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone sharing information they have already assessed for accuracy. "You've noticed him," Eli said. "I've noticed him for about 6 months," she said. "I simply now have a deputy to tell about it." He stood there for a moment with the vest in his hand and the bell above the door chiming softly in the wind that came under it, and he thought about asking her name. He did not ask. He said, "Thank you," and he meant it with more weight than the 2 words could properly carry, and he stepped out into the afternoon. He told himself he would ask Briggs her name that evening. He did not ask Briggs her name that evening. He instead sat at his desk, in the office, going through the notes he had accumulated and adding the information about Cleet Dunbar's movements to the relevant section. And the evening passed, and he told himself he would ask tomorrow. Tomorrow became the day after, and the day after became the following week, and the following week became the beginning of the 2nd month of his time in Redrock, and by that point the not knowing had become almost a habit, which he understood was irrational and somewhat worrying as a piece of self-knowledge. He did, however, go back to her shop 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, each time with a plausible reason. The 2nd time, a loose seam in the lining of his jacket. The 3rd time, a hat that needed its band restitched. The 4th time, he admitted to himself while walking over there, he had manufactured the need. A handkerchief that he claimed had come unraveled along one edge, which she examined with polite skepticism before rehemming it in about 4 minutes without comment. Each time they talked more than the time before. He learned that she had come to Redrock 3 years ago from Santa Fe. That she had set up the shop alone, which in 1878 New Mexico territory was a thing that required a particular combination of determination and willingness to withstand commentary. That she had no family currently in the territory. She mentioned parents in Ohio in a way that suggested the relationship was complicated in ways she did not choose to elaborate on. That she could read and write in both English and had working knowledge of Spanish, which in Redrock was practical rather than decorative. That she had opinions about things, the territorial government, the management of water resources, the education available to the children of the town, that she expressed with a directness that would have been considered remarkable in a woman in that era, and that he found remarkable for entirely different reasons. She was learning things about him too. He could tell by the questions she asked, which were specifically calibrated, not personal enough to be intrusive, but precise enough to reveal genuine curiosity. She asked about his previous posting, about whether he found Redrock different from what he had expected, about what he thought of the legal complexity of the Harlan situation in practical terms. She did not ask about his family or his history or what had brought him to the particular crossroads of a law enforcement career in New Mexico territory. He was grateful for this, and he was also, quietly, slightly disappointed by it, which told him something about the direction his feelings were traveling. The 5th time he went to her shop, and by this point he had exhausted any pretense of a reason, and arrived with the honest admission that he had nothing requiring repair. She was not there. The shop was locked and dark. He stood outside for a moment, which was long enough for Mrs. Agatha Fells from the general store next door to observe him and note, with the particular satisfied expression of a woman who stores social information professionally, that he was there. This annoyed him slightly, in the way that being witnessed in a vulnerable moment always slightly annoyed a private person. He found out later that she had been at the schoolhouse that afternoon, helping the schoolteacher, a young man named Peter Walsh who had been hired the previous autumn, organize a small lending library that she had helped assemble through a combination of donations and direct purchase. The children had 14 books now, which was 14 more than they'd had a year ago. He heard about this from Walsh himself, who mentioned it with obvious admiration. "Miss Finley is the most practically effective person in this town," Walsh said, with the particular reverence of a man who was slightly in awe of competence. "She simply identifies what needs doing and does it." This did not surprise Eli at all. The laugh came back into his immediate experience during the third month, at the harvest gathering that the town organized in late September. The church cleared the pews and the surrounding families brought food, and there was music, a fiddle, a guitar, a harmonica played with variable skill, and the social life of Redrock concentrated itself into one warm, lantern-lit evening with the smell of wood smoke and the first cold edge of autumn on the air outside. He had not intended to dance. He was there in a professional capacity, nominally. These gatherings occasionally provided opportunities for exactly the kind of incautious behavior that law enforcement found useful to observe. But the evening was pleasant and unthreatening, and the music was genuinely good, and he found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't fully allowed himself since arriving. He saw her across the room talking with a rancher's wife, and two other women he had come to know by face if not well by name. She was wearing a blue dress, not her working clothes, and her hair was down, which he had not seen before, and it was darker and longer than he had imagined from the pinned-up version, falling past her shoulders with that same slight tendency toward independence that the escaped strands had always suggested. 40 minutes into the gathering, the fiddle player produced a melody that made someone in the group near her say something evidently very funny, and the laugh happened. The full version. The real one. The one he had first heard through the doorway on his first day in Redrock, unself-conscious and warm and completely honest, and it was somehow exactly the way he had catalogued it in his memory over the preceding months, not idealized, not diminished, simply itself, and somehow still the finest sound in his current landscape. He was, in that moment, deeply and entirely in trouble, and he knew it with the absolute clarity of a man who has been avoiding a truth long enough that, when it finally presents itself fully, there is nothing left to do but acknowledge it. He crossed the room. Not directly to her, he was still, at core, a man who moved carefully. He moved to the vicinity, accepted a cup of cider from the table that was nearby, exchanged words with a rancher named Gus Pemberton, who was discussing cattle prices with the solemnity such topics apparently deserved. But he was close enough now that, when the group naturally shifted, as groups at social gatherings do, he and she ended up adjacent in the way that sometimes happens when everyone is generally moving in the same orbit. She looked over. She recognized him immediately, which gave him a small private satisfaction. She knew his face, had retained it, categorized him as worth remembering. "Deputy," she said, the same greeting she had used each time at the shop. "Good evening," he said. And then, because it had been 3 months, because the truth had presented itself in full and undeniable form, because the moment was exactly right in the way that certain moments simply are, he said, "I realize I've been to your shop 5 times and I've never properly introduced myself. I'm Eli Rourke." She looked at him for a beat that was slightly longer than a standard social pause, and the gray eyes had something in them he could not fully read, amusement, perhaps, or something more specific than amusement. "I know your name, Deputy Rourke," she said. "Tom Briggs mentioned it the first week you arrived, and I'm Catherine Finley. Catherine." The name settled into him with a rightness that was almost embarrassing in its completeness. "I'm glad to properly meet you," he said. "You've been properly meeting me for 3 months," she said. "You were simply doing it without the formalities. I owe you an explanation for that," he said. "You don't actually," she said, and she said it gently, which was somehow more direct than if she had said it sharply. though I'd be interested to hear one if you wanted to offer it." He considered this for a moment. The fiddle was playing something lively and two couples were dancing, and the lantern light was warm and the night outside was cool, and he had the sense of standing at exactly the kind of junction that a careful, private man usually stepped back from. "I first heard you laugh," he said, "the first afternoon I arrived in Redrock, through the door of your shop, and I thought if I learned your name the situation would become real in a way that might not survive contact with reality." She was quiet for a moment. In his peripheral vision, he could see that she had turned more fully toward him, though he was keeping his gaze at a polite middle distance. "That's either very cautious or very strange," she said. "Probably both," he said. "Eli Rourke," she said, trying the name, and the way she said it, the particular music of it went through him like a tuning fork being struck. "I've been curious about you for 3 months. You watch more carefully than any person I've ever met, and you say less than seems warranted, and every time you've come into my shop it's been transparently not about what you claimed it was about." "The button was genuine," he said. "The button was genuine," she agreed. "The handkerchief was not." He finally looked at her directly. She was looking back at him with that direct, clear gray gaze that always felt like being honestly appraised, and the expression on her face was something that he thought, hoped, very carefully allowed himself to believe was close to warm. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. He respected the pause. "Yes," she said, "I would." They danced twice that evening. The first dance was a simple two-step, common enough that there was no particular social significance in it beyond two people being present and willing. The second was a slower waltz, and in 1878, a slow waltz with a man you had not previously danced with meant something that both parties were fully aware of. She danced well the same quality of no-wasted motion that characterized everything else she did, and when the music required it, his hand was at her waist and hers was on his shoulder, and the physical reality of that proximity was significant in ways he declined to analyze in the moment, because analyzing things in the moment was one of his less useful habits. After the second dance, he walked her to the table with the cider, and they talked for an hour. Properly talked, in the way they had been building toward over months but had not quite arrived at about where he had grown up, and she told him about Ohio and why she had left, which was a combination of wanting more than Ohio offered, and the particular way that her father's disappointment in her choices had functioned as a directional guide, pointing away from his expectations toward her own. She had come west at 22, spent time in Santa Fe, decided that Redrock had the particular combination of size and need and affordability that suited her purposes. She said this plainly, without apology or performance. He told her about Kansas and the cattle work and the way he had ended up in law. He told her about the posting before this one, in a town in Colorado that had been less complicated but also less interesting. He told her that he had been thinking of this as a temporary posting. Do the work, resolve the Harlan situation, move on, but that he had found Redrock more engaging than he had expected. She asked what specifically he had found engaging. She asked it with a quality of carefully neutral curiosity that was so perfectly balanced between genuine inquiry and social safety that he almost laughed. "The people," he said, and held her gaze for precisely long enough to be unambiguous. The color that came into her face was slight but real, and she looked away for a moment, and he thought that was one of the more satisfying things he had witnessed in some time. She did not encourage or discourage what the evening had become. She was too honest for false encouragement and too intelligent for unnecessary discouragement. And what she was, he thought, was watchful, waiting to see if he was the kind of person who would follow through or the kind who retreated to safe distance after moments of vulnerability. He had spent 3 months being the second kind, and he thought she knew that, and was giving him space to demonstrate that the harvest gathering had been the beginning of something rather than a single exception. He walked her home at the end of the evening. Her rooms were above the shop, accessed by an outside stair. She thanked him at the foot of the stair with a formality that was not coldness but distance maintained by choice, and he bid her good night and walked back through the night-quiet town with the particular warm, steady feeling of a man who has done exactly the right thing and knows it. The following morning, however, was when the situation with Wade Harlan took a turn that made the personal dimension of his life considerably more complicated. Briggs called him in early and showed him a set of documents that a rancher named Joseph Terrell had brought in property deeds, signed under circumstances that Terrell described as coerced, backed by language in the deeds themselves that was legal but predatory. Terrell was afraid. His wife was afraid. They had 2 children under 10, a small spread that had been in the family since before the territory was territory, and Harlan's men had made it comprehensively clear what the consequences of noncompliance would be. "How many others?" Eli asked. "At least 4 I know of," Briggs said. "Probably more who haven't come forward." And Harlan's response, "If we start formally investigating." Briggs's expression was heavy. "He has a lawyer in Santa Fe who costs more per day than I earn in a month. He has connections to the Territorial Land Office. He has enough armed men on his payroll that a direct confrontation would be." He let the sentence finish itself. "We need to build an evidentiary case," Eli said. "Not just testimonials, documented proof of coercion. Which means someone needs to find it. Which means I need to go through Harlan's records." He thought for a moment. "He keeps records. His foreman Dunbar manages the operations paperwork. It goes to a ledger office in town. He uses a room above the feed store for it." Eli knew the room. He had identified it weeks ago. "Give me time," Eli said. He spent the next 2 weeks being very careful. He made contact with 2 of the ranchers who had sold under duress and documented their accounts in detail. He identified which of Harlan's men could be characterized as loyal for pay versus loyal from conviction, and noted that the former category was significantly larger. He established, through patient observation, the schedule of when Dunbar was and was not at the ledger office. During this same period, he continued to see Catherine. Not constantly, and not in a way that was obvious to the town's considerable social observation apparatus. 3 times he came into the shop with genuine pretense. She had offered to make him a proper set of work shirts in exchange for a fair price, and this required measurements and consultation on material, which provided sufficient reason for visits. Once they walked together in the early morning when she was going to the well and he happened to be starting his rounds, and the company stretched from practical coincidence into an hour of walking the quieter streets while the town was still mostly asleep. She told him more about the pressure Harlan had been applying to her specifically. He had not, she said, made overt threats. He was too sophisticated for that. What he had done was approach her about purchasing her building. He owned the property on both sides of her shop and apparently wanted the full block, and when she declined, the approach had shifted to something she described as persistent inconvenience. Suppliers she worked with had received visits from Dunbar that coincided with their subsequent decisions to raise her prices or reduce their reliability. The landlord who owned her building, a decent man named Porter, no relation to Eli's horse, had received a visit from one of Harlan's lawyers. "Why specifically you?" Eli asked. She hesitated. "My building sits over the best documented water access on the eastern side of town," she said. "There's an underground cistern that the original builder documented in the property deeds. Harlan wants the water rights. He's been acquiring water access systematically across the county for 2 years." Eli added this to the picture he was building, and the picture became more coherent and more damning with each new piece. Harlan was not simply accumulating wealth through predatory land acquisition. He was building toward a chokehold on the water supply in a region where water was existential, and he was doing it with enough legal insulation that confronting him required either overwhelming evidence or a willingness to operate in ways that Eli would not. He chose evidence. It was during the 3rd week of October when he found the ledger. He had entered the room above the feed store late on a Wednesday night, using a method that was technically unauthorized but operationally necessary, and that Briggs had approved with the particular pragmatism of a man who understood the difference between legal and ineffective and effective and technically problematic. The ledger was exactly what he had hoped for, a meticulous record of transactions that documented not just the official acquisitions, but the parallel payments, the amounts that had gone to the territorial land office contact, the specific dates and sums that could be matched to the coercion timeline that Terrell and the others had described. He spent 3 hours in that room, by the light of a small lantern, copying the relevant pages in his own hand, because taking the original ledger would have been noticed. His handwriting was precise and he worked quickly, and by the time he left he had a copy that was comprehensive enough to form the basis of a formal complaint to the territorial marshal. He felt, walking back through the dark streets, the particular satisfaction of a case coming together. It was the feeling that made law enforcement worth doing, not the dramatic confrontations, which were mostly dangerous and unpleasant, but the slow accumulation of truth into a shape that could not be ignored. He stopped at the foot of Catherine's outside stair without having consciously intended to. The window above was dark, which was correct. It was past midnight and she was sensibly asleep. He stood there for a moment in the cold October night and understood, with the same completeness with which he had understood the harvest-gathering moment, that he was not going to continue to move carefully and slowly and indefinitely, that the case would eventually resolve, one way or another, and what happened after the case resolved depended on choices made now. He went back to the office and wrote the formal complaint until dawn. He sent it through the territorial marshal's office the following morning, along with the copied ledger pages and a cover letter that Briggs co-signed. The process, from submission to formal response, would take a minimum of 6 weeks, and in the meantime they had to hold the situation stable enough that Harlan did not destroy evidence or escalate his tactics. This was the part that concerned Eli. Harlan was not an unintelligent man. He had built his operation through a combination of legal knowledge and ruthless patience, and a man like that had an instinct for when the ground was shifting under him. Whether he had a contact inside the territorial marshal's office, Eli didn't know, but he had to assume the possibility. He told Catherine this. He told her in the private capacity of a man who trusted her judgment and believed she deserved to have accurate information about her own situation, not in any official capacity, and he told her plainly. He said that the formal process was in motion, that it was solid, that it would likely succeed, but that the period between now and success was potentially the most dangerous window because it was the window in which Harlan might decide that escalation was preferable to exposure. She listened to him in the way she always listened to things, completely, without interruption, with her eyes steady and her expression attentive. When he finished, she said, "What does escalation look like?" "Probably legal threats first," he said. "His lawyer applying pressure to your landlord or to your suppliers more aggressively than before. Then if that doesn't move you, something more direct." He paused. "I don't believe he will move to direct physical threat. That would create a legal problem he couldn't insulate himself from. But I want to be honest with you about the range of possibilities." "I appreciate that," she said. "Most people in your position would soften it. You'd know if I softened it." "I would," she agreed. They were sitting at the work table in her shop, across from each other, 2 cups of coffee between them that she had made on the small stove in the back room. The shop was closed for the day. It was Sunday, early November, and the light outside was the flat gray of overcast high desert autumn. It was the most settled, most domestic, most quietly intimate moment they had shared, and both of them were aware of it without making it explicitly the subject of their conversation. "Eli," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without the surname, and it landed with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to its brevity. "Yes. I want to ask you something directly, and I would like a direct answer." "You'll get one." She looked at him across the cups of coffee and the work table and the small space of Sunday morning between them. "What is this?" she said. "Between us. Because I am old enough and independent enough that I don't do well with things that are undefined, and I think we are past the point where leaving it undefined serves either of us." He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because it was a large answer and he wanted to give it honestly rather than casually. "I came to Redrock with no intention of anything other than work," he said. "I have, over the past 3 months, become someone who intends considerably more than that. The honest answer to your question is that I am hoping, if you are willing, for the kind of understanding between two people that leads somewhere. Specifically somewhere that involves staying in one place long enough for things to properly develop." She studied him for a moment. "You're saying you want to court me." "I'm saying I want to court you," he confirmed. "If that's agreeable to you." The small smile appeared. Not the polite one and not the public one, the private, unguarded version that he had seen in glimpses, and that was, if anything, more effective than the laugh. "It's agreeable to me," she said. "Good," he said. And then, because the moment seemed to require something beyond procedural confirmation, he added, "You are the most interesting person I have met in a very long time, Catherine." "That is the right thing to say," she said, "and you said it exactly right." November was the best month of his life to that point. He courted her in the careful, genuine way of a man who means it, not with theatrical gestures but with presence and attention, and the particular form of respect that consists of treating a person as fully intelligent and fully capable and fully deserving of honesty. He walked with her. He ate Sunday dinner with her twice at the hotel dining room, which was the appropriate public venue for that kind of social declaration. He brought her coffee when he was making rounds past her shop at mid-morning, and she brought him the occasional piece of information, something she had heard, something a customer had mentioned, something that added texture to the picture of Harlan's operations that he was continuing to develop. They talked about books, because she had 3 shelves of them above her shop and he had been a reader since childhood. They talked about what they wanted, not in an abstract, we should want the same things way, but in the direct, this is what I want, what do you want way that was Catherine's conversational mode. She wanted to stay in Redrock, or somewhere very like it. She wanted the shop to grow, possibly to expand into teaching dressmaking to young women who needed a practical skill. She wanted, she said with a straightforwardness that he admired enormously, children eventually, if circumstances were agreeable, and she was saying this now rather than later because she was 26 and life was not infinitely long, and she had no interest in investing in something that would ultimately be incompatible. He told her he wanted the same things. He told her he had been thinking about Redrock as the place to stay, and that this thought had begun before he was consciously aware of the reason, and that he was now fully aware of the reason. "Is the reason me?" she asked. "The reason is you," he said. "All right," she said. "Then we understand each other." They did understand each other, which was the most genuinely comfortable thing he had experienced with another person in his adult life. There was a quality to their time together that did not require effort to maintain the easiness of two people who are in actual agreement about the world at a level deep enough to make all the surface negotiations simpler. In December, he kissed her for the first time. They had been walking in the evening, returning from a visit to the Terrell family's spread where he had gone to update Joseph Terrell on the progress of the formal complaint. And she had come because she and Martha Terrell had known each other since Catherine had been in Redrock, and the evening had stretched into supper with the Terrells, and a long, comfortable ride back under a sky that was absolutely saturated with stars. The way the high desert sky is in December when the air is clear and cold, and the darkness is complete. They were at the foot of her stair again, which had become a location with accumulated meaning, and she had turned to say good night, and he had kissed her in the simple, certain way of a man who is not conducting an experiment but doing something he has decided on, and she had kissed him back in exactly the same manner. When they stepped back, neither of them lingered, because they were both people who understood the value of doing things in the right order, and there were right orders to respect. She looked at him with that clear gray gaze and said, "That was a long time coming." "About 3.5 months," he agreed. "Worth it," she said, which was perhaps the finest thing anyone had ever said to him. He walked home through the December dark with his hands in his pockets and the cold air sharp in his lungs, and a feeling of such complete rightness about everything that it was almost alarming. The alarm became literal 2 days later. Briggs received word through informal channels that Harlan had learned. The exact nature of the leak was unclear, that a formal complaint had been filed with the territorial marshal. The response was not the measured escalation through legal channels that Eli had predicted. Harlan had apparently decided, for reasons that spoke to a man beginning to feel cornered, that the moment called for something more decisive. 3 things happened in quick succession. First, Catherine's landlord received a visit from Harlan's lawyer and emerged from it visibly shaken, refusing to say specifically what had been discussed, but making sounds about renegotiating the terms of her tenancy. Second, Cleet Dunbar appeared at the general store next door with 2 of Harlan's men, and spent an hour inside talking to the owner in terms that the owner described afterward to Briggs as extremely clear. Third, and most significantly, a package arrived at the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe containing documentation that, according to a contact of Briggs who worked at the marshal's office, and was both reliable and deeply uncomfortable about what he was telling them, appeared to be fabricated evidence suggesting that the complaint against Harlan was itself the result of a conspiracy between Briggs and certain land speculators to drive Harlan out and acquire his holdings. This was elegant from a purely operational perspective. Eli hated that he could recognize its elegance while also recognizing its complete fabrication. Harlan had apparently decided that the best defense was to create enough doubt about the integrity of the complaint itself to muddy the waters sufficiently that formal action became complicated. "He has someone at the marshal's office," Briggs said heavily. "Or someone who can reach someone there," Eli said, which amounts to the same problem. They were at a disadvantage that was not easily addressed from Redrock. The formal channels had been corrupted to an uncertain degree, and operating through formal channels against a man who had compromised those channels was not going to produce results on a useful timeline. "What we need," Eli said, thinking through it carefully, "is to go over the marshal's office, directly to the territorial governor, through a route that Harlan cannot intercept or corrupt. That requires someone in Santa Fe," Briggs said. "It requires someone trustworthy in Santa Fe who can deliver documents in person to the governor's secretary." They both thought about who they knew in Santa Fe who was trustworthy, reliable, and not already known to Harlan. The list was not long. The name that emerged from it was a former judge named Augustus Hale, who had retired to Santa Fe 2 years ago, and who Briggs had known for 20 years, and would stake his professional reputation on. "I'll write to Hale," Briggs said. "Write tonight," Eli said. "Get it out on tomorrow's post." He went back to his office and sat down and tried to think calmly through the situation, which was more difficult than it should have been because the part of the situation that involved Catherine Finley's position specifically was producing a quality of anxiety that was not strictly professional in its character. Harlan was moving against the formal complaint. In doing so, he was also moving against the witnesses and the people who had cooperated with the investigation, and Catherine was connected to that investigation in ways that were on Harlan's record. The pressure on her landlord, the intimidation of the neighboring business, these were escalations, not coincidences, and Eli knew what the next escalation in that sequence looked like. He went to see her that evening. He told her what had happened with the fabricated evidence at the marshal's office and with the contacts in town. He watched her face process this and then settle into the particular stillness that her face took on when she was deciding something. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Be careful," he said. "Don't be alone in the shop after dark. Lock the storeroom where the property documents are, and if anyone from Harlan's operation approaches you directly, I'll come to you immediately, she said, or to Briggs if I'm not available. I'd rather come to you, she said, and said it simply, without romantic overstatement, just as a statement of her preference, and he understood that what she was actually saying was that she trusted him specifically, and that this trust was not transferable without reason. Then come to me, he said. The weeks between that conversation and the moment described at the story's opening were the most operationally tense of Eli's professional career, and simultaneously the most personally rich of his adult life, which was an odd combination that he acknowledged to himself with something approaching dry humor. The evidence was being assembled. The letter to Judge Hale had gone out, and a response had come back indicating that Hale was willing to make a personal delivery to the governor's secretary, and that he had, in fact, already been in communication with one of the governor's staff about a separate Harlan-related matter that, when combined with Eli and Briggs's documentation, formed a picture that was very nearly comprehensive. Nearly. There were 2 weeks of waiting, and in those 2 weeks Eli and Catherine reached the kind of understanding that exists when 2 people have decided something about each other and are simply living forward into the decision. She cooked supper for him twice in the small rooms above her shop, which was a degree of domesticity that, in 1878, New Mexico carried a particular social significance that they were both conscious of and neither felt inclined to retreat from. He told her more about Kansas, about his father, who was still alive, still working cattle, and who Eli realized he should probably write to and had been putting off, not because the relationship was bad, but because it was complicated in ways that were hard to compress into a letter. She told him more about Ohio and the father whose disappointment had been a launching mechanism, and there was something in the way she talked about it now that had slightly less edge than before, as though the distance and the 3 years of building something in Redrock had given her enough ground beneath her feet that the old wound was still there, but no longer determining. She showed him the property documents one evening, the ones documenting the underground cistern and the water rights that made her building specifically interesting to Harlan. She had been keeping them in a locked tin in the back of the storeroom, which was sensible, but they discussed the possibility of sending copies to Briggs's office and to Hale in Santa Fe as additional protection, and she agreed this was wise. He loved her by this point with a certainty that was not dramatic or sudden, but was simply fully present, the way that things which have been growing slowly arrive at their full size without a particular announcement. He had not said this aloud. He was building toward it in the way he built toward everything, deliberately, with attention to the right moment. But it was there, and he was aware that she knew it was there, in the way that 2 people who pay close attention to each other always know the territory of the other's feeling even before it is mapped in words. And then the letter arrived. The letter that hit the floor of the sheriff's office on a December afternoon, addressed to Catherine Finley in Wade Harlan's handwriting. Eli had not been there when it arrived. He had come in an hour after Briggs received it, while Catherine had already been and gone. Briggs had kept the letter because it was evidence, and because the contents, which Briggs had opened, with Catherine's permission, in her presence, were a threat written in the language of someone who no longer had anything to lose. Harlan knew about the letter to Judge Hale. He knew that the formal complaint was going to reach the governor despite his efforts with the marshal's office. He knew that his window was closing. And so the letter was, in effect, an ultimatum. Sign over the property rights to the cistern and the building, and publicly withdraw any cooperation with any investigation of Harlan's operations, and the pressure would cease. Do not sign, and the pressure would become something that the letter left elegantly but unmistakably unambiguous. Catherine had read this letter and then, apparently, had gone calm in the way that Eli had come to understand meant she had made a decision, not that she was accepting the situation. which was why she had ridden out alone with a rifle across her saddle toward Harlan's property line. Eli pushed Porter hard across the 2 miles of open ground between town and the edge of Harlan's holding, which was a flat expanse of grama grass and scrubby cedar that in the December afternoon light had a bleak and beautiful quality he was in no mood to appreciate. He could see a 1/4 mile ahead a single rider stopped at the cedar post fence that marked the boundary. He came up alongside her at a pace that brought Porter skidding to a stop in a small cloud of dust. She looked at him. Her expression was calm and direct and entirely not surprised to see him. The rifle was still across her saddle, but she had not drawn it. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. "Probably true," she said. "I'm not alone now." "What are you doing, Catherine?" She looked back toward the fence. On the other side of it, perhaps 200 yards away, was the beginning of the track that led to Harlan's main house. From where they were, 2 riders were visible coming toward them along that track. One of them was Cleet Dunbar. "He sent the letter," she said. "I thought he should see that it didn't work. You could have told me and I could have communicated that through official channels." "Official channels take time," she said, "and I wanted him to see it." He understood this completely and without the ability to argue against it. She had spent 3 years building her life in Redrock against consistent pressure from a man who had decided that her water rights were more important than her livelihood, and she had done it with professionalism and patience and strategic intelligence, and the letter had been a line crossed in a way that required a response that was direct and visible and personally delivered. "All right," he said. He moved Porter so that he was beside her rather than in front of her, facing the approaching riders, his badge visible, his right hand resting with deliberate casualness near the holster on his hip. "Then we'll communicate it together." Dunbar pulled up 10 yards from the fence. He was a broad-shouldered man with a flat, unreadable expression and the particular stillness of someone who was used to being the one who made other people nervous. The rider behind him was one of Harlan's regular hands, carrying the easy posture of a man who was being paid to be present rather than to make specific decisions. "Deputy," Dunbar said. "Dunbar," Eli said. "Miss Finley." Dunbar looked at Catherine with the practiced blankness of a professional intimidator. "Mr. Harlan is expecting your response to his letter." "This is his response," Catherine said. Her voice was level, and her posture was the particular upright quality that he had noticed on the first day in the church, the quality of someone who was comfortable in the space they occupied. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not withdrawing anything. And I would like you to tell Mr. Harlan personally that the formal complaint currently being reviewed by the office of the territorial governor, not the marshal's office. The governor's office includes documentation of the letter he sent this morning as an additional exhibit of pattern behavior." Something moved behind Dunbar's eyes. Not quite surprise, he was too practiced for that, but a recalibration. "The governor's office," he said. "The governor's office," Eli confirmed. "The documentation was personally delivered to the governor's secretary by Augustus Hale, who I expect you know, 3 days ago. A formal response is expected within 2 weeks. This was slightly ahead of the timeline Eli actually had confirmation on, but the essence of it was true, and the slight advancement served the purpose of this particular exchange. Dunbar looked at them both for a long moment. The land was quiet around them, the wind flat and cold, the December sky a pale gray-blue overhead. Then he turned his horse and rode back without another word, the second rider following. Catherine exhaled. Not a shaky exhale, a controlled release, the kind a person makes when they've been holding themselves very steady for a necessary period and are now allowing the steadiness to relax by 1 degree. "The governor's office," she said. "As of 3 days ago, yes. You could have told me this when you came in the morning." "I was going to," he said. Briggs wanted to wait until he had formal confirmation of the timeline. She looked at him. He looked at her. The whole long arc of the preceding months, the laugh through the doorway, the button, the handkerchief he had manufactured as an excuse, The harvest gathering, the Sunday morning coffee, December and the stars and the foot of her stair was present between them in the December air. "I need to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been working toward saying that for some time, and I am choosing this particular moment because it seems important to say it while we're both here and the situation is what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. The gray eyes were very clear and very direct, and the small private smile appeared, the one that was more effective than anything else, and she said, "I love you too, Eli Rourke. I have for some time." "Good," he said. "That's the same thing you said when I agreed to let you court me," she said. "It seemed appropriate." "It was," she said. They rode back to Redrock side by side in the December afternoon, and the town looked different than it had always looked to him, not larger or more impressive, because Redrock was not impressive in scale, but settled, present, real in the way that places become real when they contain the people who matter to you. The formal process moved with a speed that suggested the governor's office had been waiting for exactly this kind of complete, well-documented complaint. Within 3 weeks, a territorial commission arrived in Redrock, 4 men from Santa Fe, including a territorial prosecutor and 2 deputies who operated under the governor's direct authority, which made them immune to the kind of interference that had complicated the marshal's office situation. Wade Harlan was arrested on the 23rd of January, 1879, at his main house by the territorial deputies, with Eli and Briggs present as local law enforcement. Clete Dunbar was arrested simultaneously at the ledger office above the feed store. The land office contact in Santa Fe was removed from his position and referred for prosecution. The fabricated evidence that had been submitted to the marshal's office was formally identified and documented as part of the case against Harlan. It did not go perfectly. Nothing that goes through legal channels in the frontier West goes perfectly. Harlan's Santa Fe lawyer was, as Briggs had predicted, enormously expensive and somewhat effective, and the full prosecution took the better part of 6 more months and 2 trips by Briggs and Eli to Santa Fe to testify. Joseph Terrell and the other ranchers who had sold under duress were not immediately restored to their original positions. That process was even more complicated, but the formal mechanisms for it were set in motion, and the man who had been applying systematic pressure to their lives was no longer in a position to apply it. The charges that ultimately held against Harlan were land fraud, bribery of a territorial official, and extortion. He received a sentence that removed him from Cobb County as a practical matter of geography, which was the functional outcome that mattered most to the people of Redrock. Dunbar took a reduced deal in exchange for testimony against Harlan, which Eli found professionally satisfying if personally unsatisfying, since Dunbar's personal accountability to the ranchers he had intimidated was not fully addressed. This was the nature of legal processes. He had learned to accept the good outcomes without requiring them to be complete. The water rights to Catherine's building were formally confirmed in her name by the court as part of the resolution of the property fraud case. Her landlord, relieved of the pressure that had been applied to him, renewed her tenancy with terms that were straightforward and fair. In February, after the arrest but before the case had fully worked its way through the legal process, Eli asked Catherine to marry him. He did not contrive a dramatic moment for this, because neither of them was a person who required dramatic moments for things they had already decided. He asked her on a Tuesday morning, in her shop, over the same work table where they had sat with coffee in November, while the gray light came through the window. He told her that he intended to remain in Redrock, that Briggs had offered him the deputy position on a permanent basis and that he was accepting it, that the town was where he wanted to be, that she was who he wanted to be with, and would she marry him? She said yes without hesitation. She said yes in the direct, unperformed, completely honest way that she said everything, and then she said, "I was wondering when you were going to ask." I decided some time ago that if you hadn't asked by spring I was going to ask you. You would have, he said. Without question, she said. I'm not a person who waits indefinitely for things I want. I know, he said. It's one of the many things I love about you. They were married in April 1879, in the church in Redrock, the one with the new roof that Catherine had organized a community fundraising effort to pay for over the winter, in what had been both a genuinely necessary practical project and a characteristically Catherine approach to her own needs. If the church needed a roof, and she needed a church for a wedding, the solution was a community effort that addressed the public need while also serving the private one. The wedding was attended by essentially the whole town, which was the natural consequence of having spent months courting someone who was integral to the community in practical and visible ways. Peter Walsh, the schoolteacher, played the guitar. Agatha Fells from the general store provided enough food to constitute a small feast. Joseph Terrell came with his wife Martha and their children, and there was a quality to his presence grateful, relieved, something that had come back to his posture after the long months of fear and pressure, that Eli thought was the specific feeling of a man who had been given his life back by the workings of an imperfect but functional justice. Catherine walked to him in the church in the blue dress she had made herself, not the same blue dress from the harvest gathering, a new one, better made, the best dress she had ever created, because she was an honest person and honesty included acknowledging that you deserved your own best work on the most important day of your life. He looked at her face when she stopped beside him and he thought about the first laugh through the doorway, and the button, and the Sunday morning coffee, and December and the stars, and all the careful months of building toward a person who was also building toward him. And the thought that surfaced was simply that he had done exactly the right things by being patient and honest and present, and that this was the right place and the right person and the right life. The minister asked if he took her to be his wife. I do, he said, and meant it with every specific and accumulated weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. She said her own vows in her own voice, clear and unhesitating, and when it was done and he kissed her for the second time, the first having been in December under the cold stars, she put her hand briefly against the side of his face in a gesture that was so private and so present that it was between them alone despite the 100 people watching, and he understood that he was going to spend the rest of his life paying attention to a person who deserved all of the attention he had to give. They moved Catherine's things into a larger space. Eli had been living in one room above the hardware store, which was insufficient for 2 people, and their combined accumulation of books, and they took rooms above and beside the shop that gave Catherine more working space than before, a proper front room and a kitchen and 2 bedrooms, and the domesticity of it was not a reduction of either of them but an expansion, the particular way that a shared life is larger than 2 separate ones. In the summer of that year, 1879, Catherine expanded her shop and began offering dressmaking lessons to 3 young women in town, which was the beginning of the thing she had described wanting back in November, a way to pass the practical skill forward. The first 3 students were a banker's daughter who wanted to make her own clothes and had been told this was not a suitable occupation for a girl of her social position. A young Mexican woman named Rosa who had been working in the hotel kitchen since she was 14 and who had an extraordinary eye for color and pattern, and a widow who had arrived in Redrock with almost nothing and needed a marketable skill urgently. The banker's daughter lasted 2 months before her father intervened. Rosa learned faster than anyone Catherine had ever taught, and within a year was producing work that Catherine described, with honest admiration, as better than her own early work. The widow was employed in the shop by winter, part-time, in an arrangement that gave her income and gave Catherine assistance with the volume of work that was increasing as the shop's reputation spread to the neighboring towns. These were the good months. They were also the months in which the last threads of the Harlan case wound through the legal system and closed, and in which the Terrell family recovered their full land rights through a process that was slow and arduous but ultimately successful, and in which Redrock itself grew slightly, a new family arriving from Texas, a second doctor setting up practice, a small newspaper that Peter Walsh had been talking about for a year becoming an actual printed sheet that appeared on alternate Thursdays. It was a life, in other words. A full, forward-moving, built-by-hand life in a specific place with specific people. And Eli Rourke, who had spent 10 years moving through the West without particularly stopping anywhere, found that stopping felt exactly the way he had hoped it would when he had been unable to articulate exactly what he was hoping for. In the autumn of 1879 October, the same month as the previous year's harvest gathering where everything between them had properly begun, Catherine told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the particular directness that was her mode for everything, and he looked at her for a moment with the kind of feeling that does not have a specific word, but that is located somewhere between gratitude and astonishment, and the very simple recognition that this was exactly and precisely what he wanted. He crossed the kitchen and held her with his face against her hair and said nothing for a long moment, which was all right because she was a person who understood that silence from him was a form of communication rather than an absence of it. "Good," she said, in his voice from months ago, with a slight warm humor that he felt against his shoulder. He laughed, genuinely and fully, in the way that she had first laughed through the doorway on the afternoon he arrived in Redrock, and she pulled back to look at his face with an expression that was pure and warm and entirely hers. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh like that," she said. "You've been teaching me," he said. Their son was born in May of 1880, in the rooms above the shop, with the assistance of the town's doctor and Martha Terrell, who had become one of Catherine's closest friends during the preceding year, and who had the kind of steady, practical presence that is invaluable in the particular circumstances of a birth. They named him James, after Eli's father, with the middle name Henry, after Catherine's grandfather on her mother's side, the family member she spoke of with uncomplicated warmth, the one who had believed that she was capable of more than her father's Ohio expectations allowed. James Henry Rourke arrived with a full head of dark hair and a disposition that in the first weeks seemed to involve primarily sleeping, eating, and registering strong opinions about the difference between the two. Eli held him in the first hour with a care so thorough and precise that Catherine, watching from the bed with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who has just accomplished something significant, said, "You're treating him like evidence." "Carefully," Eli said. "He's not going to break." "I'm aware of that in theory," he said. She laughed, and James, in the manner of newborns, did not notice, but Eli looked up from his son's face to his wife's face, and the particular quality of the laugh, the real one, the full one, the one that had started everything, resonated with everything it had accumulated since the first afternoon through the doorway. He thought, "I memorized the way she laughed before I ever dared to learn her name, and what I was memorizing was the sound of a life I was going to want." Briggs retired in the summer of 1880, citing his knee, which had been unreliable for years, and a general assessment of Redrock as adequately pacified for a man of his age to put down with satisfaction. The county appointed Eli to fill the sheriff's position, which was a formality in one sense since he had been doing the substantive work for over a year, but which came with a new badge and a modest increase in pay that was useful given the recent expansion of their household. Sheriff Eli Rourke settled into the role with the same quality of thoroughness that had characterized his work as a deputy, but with the additional weight of authority that came from being the primary law in a place rather than the supporting one. He was good at it. He was good at it in the particular way of a man who had spent years observing the thing before doing it, who understood that the work was mostly patient attention and the maintenance of trust rather than dramatic confrontation, and who was known well enough in the community to be approached by people with problems they might have hesitated to bring to a stranger. Catherine continued to build the shop. By 1881, she had 2 employees and a reputation that extended to 3 neighboring towns, and the lending library at the schoolhouse had grown from 14 books to 62, primarily through a combination of her own sourcing and a letter-writing campaign to various Eastern publishers that had produced a small but steady stream of donated volumes. The dressmaking class had produced Rosa, who was by now effectively a partner in the shop's operations, and 3 other women who had taken what they learned into their own work in the region. She wrote to her parents in Ohio in the spring of 1881. Eli knew about this because she told him, without drama, that she had written the letter and that she was not sure what response, if any, she would receive, and that she thought it was time because she had a husband and a son and a life that was hers completely, and that she wanted to offer her parents the option of being part of it, even if the offer had a significant chance of being declined. The response came 6 weeks later. Her mother had written it. Her father had apparently added 3 lines at the bottom of the letter that were stiff but not hostile, and her mother had written 2 pages that were warm in the tentative way of a woman who had been waiting to be approached, and who was very careful not to claim too much reunion too quickly. Catherine read it at the kitchen table and was quiet for a while afterward, and Eli sat with her and did not fill the silence, and eventually she said, "My mother sounds like she's been lonely." "That's worth something," he said. "It is," she said. She wrote back. The correspondence became, over the following years, a regular thread, not the fully repaired relationship of a sentimental story, but something honest and gradual, and built on what actually existed rather than what should theoretically exist, which was, Eli thought, exactly the Catherine Rourke approach to everything. James, at 2, was a person of strong opinions and extraordinary energy, who had inherited his mother's directness and his father's habit of watching everything carefully before deciding to engage. He also had his mother's laugh, which appeared around 18 months, full and genuine and entirely unself-conscious, and which continued to be the finest sound in the Rourke household's daily landscape. In the autumn of 1882, their daughter Clara arrived, born in October with her father's brown hair and a disposition that by the end of the first month had established itself as principally philosophical, regarding the household with a serene and watchful calm that made her father say, "She's already suspicious of us," and her mother say, "She's just gathering information." James, 2½, treated his new sister with the careful and somewhat mystified interest of a small person encountering a smaller person and finding the situation largely unclear. He would grow, as years passed, into a protective older brother with the particular combination of his parents' traits that made him both watchful and direct, which served him well. The town grew around them. The newspaper became a weekly. The church got its interior painted. The school expanded to 2 rooms with 2 teachers, Peter Walsh still running it with the same earnest dedication, and now with the assistance of a young woman teacher named Ellen who had come from Colorado and who was, as Mrs. Fells at the general store noted with professional satisfaction, exchanging particular looks with Walsh that suggested the town might be witnessing the formation of another household. They were. The Terrell family's land was fully restored, and they expanded their operation modestly, cautiously, with the carefulness of people who had learned what could be lost. Joseph Terrell shook Eli's hand at the county fair in 1881 and said something about debt and gratitude that he delivered with the economy of a man who did not have an extensive vocabulary for emotional things, and Eli received it in exactly the spirit it was given. Rosa, who had come to Catherine as a student and become a partner, married a carpenter named Miguel in 1882, and the Rourkes attended the wedding, which was held in the plaza of the small Catholic church at the south end of town, and which had the particular quality of happiness that belongs to celebrations of people who have earned good things. In the winter of 1883, a letter came from Eli's father in Kansas. Not an unusual letter in content. His father wrote every few months, in the plain and abbreviated style of a man who had never been entirely comfortable with the written word, but who had, over the years since Eli had settled in Redrock, made the consistent effort. This letter, however, contained the information that his father's health was declining and that he was considering whether to stay on the property alone or to make some different arrangement. Eli and Catherine talked about it for 2 evenings. The conversation included the possibility of his father coming to Redrock, which his father would resist, the possibility of Eli taking a leave of absence to go to Kansas, which presented practical difficulties, and the possibility of writing to his father's nearest neighbor, a family named Crandall who had known Eli's father for 15 years, and with whom there was an established relationship of mutual practical support. They wrote to the Crandalls, who responded quickly and helpfully, indicating that they had been aware of the situation and were already providing assistance in informal ways, and were willing to do so more formally if arrangements were made. Eli's father, when this was communicated to him, objected in the style of a man who objected to everything that involved receiving help, but who ultimately accepted it in the style of a man who understood that certain battles were not useful to fight. The health decline was gradual rather than sudden, which was both a mercy and a long worry, and the letters from Kansas became more frequent in both directions. Eli planned a trip in the spring of 1884, which he made with Catherine and the children, James 4, Clara 18 months, and which was the first time he had been in Kansas since coming west. His father, thinner and slower than the man Eli had last seen 8 years ago, met Catherine with the reserved but genuine warmth of a man who had been hoping to meet her for years, and was making an effort he would not have described as an effort. He held Clara with a practiced ease that spoke to the grandfather instinct, arriving intact despite the years of distance. He watched James for an afternoon with the particular expression of a man seeing his own traits organized into a new small person, and said nothing about it because that was his mode, but the expression said enough. They stayed 3 weeks. The visit was important in ways that were not immediately sayable, but that settled something in Eli, in his father, in the ongoing structure of a life that had been largely lived in forward motion, and was now fully rooted enough to include a looking back that was not sad. Eli's father died in October of 1884, quietly in his own house, with the Crandall family present. The letter reached Redrock 6 days later. Eli read it at the kitchen table and sat with it for a while, and Catherine sat with him, and James came in and asked what was wrong, and Catherine explained, with the clarity that she brought to difficult things, that Grandfather Rourke had died, and that this meant they were sad, and James considered this with the watchful seriousness of a 4-year-old deciding how to organize a large piece of information. They held a small memorial at the church in Redrock, which felt right, not because his father had ever been in Redrock, but because Redrock was Eli's home now, and his father's life deserved acknowledgement in the place where his son had built something. Time moved, as time does, with more speed than expected and more richness than could be fully catalogued. Redrock in the mid-1880s was a town that had stabilized into something that was not the raw-edged frontier of its earlier years, but was not yet the settled ordinariness of later decades. It was in that particular middle state of a place that had survived its own violence and was building on the foundation of what remained. The Rourke household, by 1885, had settled into the rhythms of a life that was full in both the small daily sense and the larger sense of purpose. Eli was known as a fair and thorough sheriff who dealt with the ordinary business of a working town, disputes between neighbors, occasional theft, the management of the few people who arrived in town with intentions that the town was better off without, with the same patient attention he had always brought to things. He was not a dramatic figure in the community, and this was precisely how he wanted it. The drama was over. What remained was the actual work of a life, which was more satisfying. Catherine's shop had become a genuine institution. Young women from 3 counties came to learn from her. The quality of her own work had been recognized at the Territorial Fair in Santa Fe in 1884, where she had shown 3 pieces and received recognition from the organizing committee in a form that she received with gracious pleasure and described afterward to Eli as more official than I expected and less overwhelming than I feared. She had also, by this point, been writing. Not for publication, or not yet, but the accumulating observations and records of a woman who had spent years at the center of a community's practical life, who had witnessed and sometimes influenced things that were worth documenting. The writing was in notebooks, kept in the same storeroom where she had once kept the property documents that Harlan had wanted, and Eli read them sometimes with her permission and found them remarkable, the voice entirely hers, clear and direct and occasionally funny in the particular way that found the genuine absurdity in serious things. "You should find someone to publish these," he said. "Perhaps," she said, which was her way of saying she was thinking about it. Their 3rd child came in the spring of 1886, a son they named Robert, who arrived with red hair that neither parent could account for, and that was the subject of considerable good-humored comment from the community. Robert was from the beginning a person of enormous social energy, interested in everyone and everything, filling whatever room he occupied with the particular warm noise of a person who finds the world primarily delightful. James, 6 by then, observed his new brother with the same philosophical watchfulness with which Clara had observed the world from her first months, and said that Robert was very loud and seemed happy about it, which was accurate. Clara, 3, was immediately and completely devoted to the baby in the way of some 3-year-olds, treating him as a personal project. The house above and beside the shop, which had already been expanded once, required further expansion with 3 children, and in the summer of 1886 they had a second room built onto the back by Miguel the carpenter, now an established and respected craftsman in the town, who did the work with the particular pride of a man who understood that he was building space for people he cared about. In the evenings in the kitchen, with the children asleep in their rooms and the night quiet outside the windows, Eli and Catherine had the kind of conversations that a marriage accumulates over years. Not the urgent, discovering conversations of early courtship, but something richer and more various, built on a shared language that was particular to them. They argued sometimes in the direct, honest way of 2 people who respected each other enough not to avoid disagreement, and resolved things in the same way they resolved everything, which was with patience and the fundamental understanding that they were on the same side. He watched her sometimes in the evenings when she was reading or writing in her notebooks, or just sitting with her coffee looking out the window at the town that was her creation as much as anyone's. And the feeling was still the same one that had been there at the harvest gathering and at the foot of the stair, and in the December dark settled, certain, grateful in a way that was not diminished by familiarity, but rather deepened by it. He thought, sometimes, about the laugh through the doorway and the long months of learning her by fragments before he had her name. The laugh was still there, still the full, genuine, unself-conscious thing it had always been, still the most distinctive sound in his daily world. James had inherited its qualities, and Robert had his own version of it that was slightly louder and considerably less inhibited. Clara's laugh was rare and therefore, when it appeared, exact in its effect, which was very Catherine. The town had a 25th anniversary celebration in the late 1880s, 25 years since its founding, a milestone that the newspaper commemorated with a special edition that was, by local agreement, the best thing Walsh and Ellen had produced in all their years of running it. Catherine wrote a piece for it, the first thing she had published, 4 columns on the history of the eastern end of the main street as she had seen it from her shop window over the years. It was excellent, and people said so, which prompted the newspaper to request more, which she provided, which eventually resulted in a column that ran monthly, and that became, over the following years, a document of the life of Redrock as observed by someone who had been watching carefully for a long time. The Harlan case was mentioned in the official history that the newspaper ran in the anniversary edition, with the particular neutral bureaucratic language that legal histories tend to use. Catherine's piece mentioned it differently, briefly, without drama, as a specific kind of danger that a community had managed because enough people had been willing to stand together in sufficient coordination. She mentioned Briggs, who was still alive in retirement and read the piece, and appeared at the shop the following week to say thank you in his economical fashion. She mentioned the Terrell family. She mentioned Eli in one sentence, calling him thorough, which was the exact word she had used the first time she had ever discussed him, and which he thought was the finest compliment he had ever received. In 1890, when Eli was 40 and Catherine was 38 and James was 10 and Clara was 8 and Robert was 4, and Redrock was a town with a proper school and a proper newspaper, and 3 churches now, and a train depot that had been built 2 years earlier, and that had changed the character of the commerce and the community in ways both good and complicated, Catherine's mother came to visit. The visit had been discussed for 3 years. Her father had died in 1887, which had resolved certain aspects of the conversation and left others more open than before. Her mother, now in her mid-60s and considerably more communicative than she had been in the difficult years of distance, made the journey by train from Ohio, the same train that now stopped at Redrock's new depot, and arrived on a May afternoon into a house that was full of children and books, and the smell of fabric from the workroom below, and the accumulated life of a woman who had built exactly what she had set out to build. Eli met her at the depot because Catherine had been at the shop and could not leave in time, and walked her up the main street, and she looked around at the town, at the shop with its sign that said Finley and Rourke dressmaking in the name that Catherine had insisted on when she added Rose's eventual departure from the partner role, with an expression that Eli interpreted as a woman revising her understanding of a situation. She did this, her mother said, half to herself. She did, Eli said. Most of it. At supper that evening, with the children moderately contained by the occasion and Catherine at the head of the table, in the position she occupied not because anyone had assigned it, but because she was the person things organized around, her mother watched her daughter for a long time and said, near the end of the meal, "Your father didn't understand what you were. I want you to know that I did, and I'm sorry it took me so long to tell you." The table was quiet in the way a table gets when something important has been said into it. Catherine looked at her mother for a moment. "I know," she said, "and I'm glad you're here. The visit was 2 weeks." The relationship was not repaired in those 2 weeks in any complete sense, because the damage done over years cannot be undone in a fortnight. But the foundation of something honest was laid, and her mother returned to Ohio with a different understanding of her daughter's life, and the letters afterward carried a warmth that was genuine rather than dutiful. In the years that followed, Redrock continued to grow and change in the ways that territories becoming states grow and change. New Mexico would not achieve statehood until 1912, which was beyond the scope of Eli's tenure as sheriff. He stepped down in 1895, at 45, with his knee beginning to give him the same trouble Briggs's had, and with the sense that the role he had built and the one that the growing town now needed were slightly different shapes. The man who replaced him was a younger deputy he had trained, a solid and careful man named Avery, who had Eli's thorough quality without his particular personal history, which was exactly what the next phase of the town required. After the sheriff's work, Eli did something that surprised most people who knew him and did not surprise Catherine at all. He joined Walsh at the newspaper, doing the work of a reporter with the same patient observation and precise documentation that had characterized his law enforcement career. The stories he covered were the ordinary ones of a town going about its business, land disputes, commerce, local governance, the occasional notable event. He had no gift for rhetorical flourish, but he had an exceptional gift for accuracy, and accuracy turned out to be what readers valued. Catherine published her collected columns as a small book in 1896 through a press in Santa Fe that had been publishing territorial history for 20 years. It sold modestly and was reviewed with more generosity than she had expected, and she received letters from it, from women in other territorial towns who recognized in her account something of their own experience, from historians who found the record valuable, from a few people in Ohio who had known her as a girl, and who were responding to the realization of who she had become. She kept the letters in a box in the storeroom. She would eventually write a second book, and then a third, and in the years when she was not writing or running the shop she was teaching, and the women she taught carried the practical and the intellectual skills forward in ways that spread out from Redrock in directions neither she nor they could fully trace. James Rourke, at 17, announced that he wanted to study law, which was the specific kind of ambition that made both his parents look at each other across the table with the private satisfaction of people who have built a context in which a person could want that. He was, as a young man, his mother's directness and his father's patience combined, and he was also, when he laughed, the full unself-conscious version that came from both of them, and strangers were frequently charmed by him before he had said anything particularly interesting, which was a useful trait for a lawyer. Clara, quieter and more interior than her brother, had her father's quality of observation in its most complete form, and had also inherited her mother's gift for the needle. She had been working in the shop since she was 10 with a skill that Rosa had declared, with characteristic honesty, exceptional. She had designs for things beyond Redrock, which were not yet fully formed but which her parents encouraged in the specific way of people who understood that the desire to move towards something larger than your starting place was not a rejection of the starting place, but a consequence of having been raised to be capable. Robert, at 12, was still primarily loud and social and delighted by things, and showed signs of being interested in every occupation simultaneously, which Eli told him was not a problem at 12 and might require some narrowing by 18, to which Robert had said with his characteristic certainty that he would figure it out, which Eli believed completely. In the evenings, still in the kitchen, still with the coffee and the books and the particular quiet of two people who had been in conversation for 20 years, and had not yet run out of things to say, Eli and Catherine Rourke occupied their life with the full and undefensive presence of people who had built it deliberately and knew exactly what it was worth. He told her once, on an evening in the late 1890s when the children were older and the house was quieter than it had been in years, about the first afternoon, the walk up the main street, the propped door, the laugh. Told her exactly what it had been and what it had done and what he had spent 3 months doing with it, which was carrying it around like something too valuable to risk on actual contact with the world. She listened to this with the full attention she gave to things. When he finished, she said, "You were very strange about it. I know, 3 months, nearly. You could have just come into the shop." "I wasn't ready," he said. "I didn't know that's what it was yet." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the September evening made the particular sounds of a small western town in the late 19th century: horses, a voice from somewhere down the street, the wind, the distant conversation of someone's dog with the night. "What did you think it was?" she asked. He considered this honestly. "I thought it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard," he said, "and I thought if I learned too much too quickly I might lose track of what had made it that way." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the gray eyes that were still, at nearly 47, the most direct and honest eyes he had ever looked into. "Did you," she asked, "lose track of it?" "No," he said. Not for a single day. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was a gesture she made sometimes, without preamble and without explanation, simply because she wanted to, and she was not a person who delayed things she wanted. "Good," she said. Outside the kitchen window, the stars over Redrock were the particular New Mexico stars of clear autumn nights, the sky so full of them that the darkness between was almost secondary, and the town that they had made there sat quiet and solid under the weight of all that light. And inside the kitchen that was the center of the life they had built together, Eli Rourke held his wife's hand and thought about a laugh through a doorway and a name learned too late, and the extraordinary, particular luck of having been in the right place on the right afternoon to hear both. Everything they had was built from that moment, from the willingness to memorize something before daring to name it, from the long patience of approaching a good thing with the care it deserved, from two people who understood that the real things in life were not found but made, one deliberate and honest step at a time, in a dusty town in New Mexico under an enormous sky, in the full and undefended presence of a life chosen freely and lived completely. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly everything.